Okay, we can make say report.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah. Dr. Mocombe, welcome to
Thank you for having me,
Reason
brother.
and Dialogue. What's going on, man?
Chilling. Oh yeah, now BTBT.
Man, it's a pleasure to have you. You are our very first guest, right? Again, people, this is Faith, Reason, and Dialogue with Dr. Celucien Joseph. It's a pleasure to have our first guest, our distinguished and prominent scholar, Dr. Paul Mocombe. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Paul Mocombe. In my opinion, and in fact, this is not an opinion. Let me clarify this. Dr. Mocombe is probably the most prolific Haitian scholars in the world. Some people would say this is an exaggeration. It is not, people. It's not. You got to check out his books. Why don't we begin here? Haitian Epistemology, Identity and Ideology in Haiti, Capitalism, Lacroism, and Libertarian Communism. So many books, man. Man. And this is his really his theory of phenomenological structuralism. So I have to say it slowly. So Dr. Mocombe is a former visiting professor of philosophy and sociology at Bethune-Cookman University. Currently, he's an assistant professor in sociology, assistant professor of philosophy and sociology at West Virginia State University. He's the president and CEO of the Mocombe Foundation. Man, you have written so many books, man. And hold on, let's begin like this. Haiti does not really have what we might call a philosophical tradition, right?
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that Haitians do not philosophize, right? They philosophize every day. For example, Vodou is a philosophy, right?
Yes.
The way of life. But I want you to tell me, because we have young Haitians, Captain Dokonila, how did you get interested in the discipline of philosophy?
Oh, that's well, before we get started, I want to say thank you for having me, Lou. I'm honored to be the first guest on your show. You're doing tremendous things. And in all honesty, Lou, what you're doing, interviewing young Haitian professors, this current show, that's a tremendous endeavor, because it's not too many times, especially young Black males don't see other Black males in academia. They're more likely to see Black females in academia than they are to see Black males. So you, for putting us as young academics, especially young Haitian academics, in the forefront, I think it's a tremendous job. You are to be commended, brother. Seriously. Our mutual friend Pascal and I talked about, even though you and him may disagree politically.
That's my buddy. Listen. We talked for almost like 2 hours yesterday.
He told me. He called me this morning. He called me this morning at 4 o'clock in the morning. We were talking about that. So the work you're doing, brother, is tremendous. And to answer your question, it's funny. When I started college, my major, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon.
Wow.
Wow. Brother,
you never told me that.
Yes. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. And then I had a Black female professor, Dr. Johnson, and she said I had a God complex. And if I became a surgeon, I would get into trouble. So anyway, So as an undergrad, I went into history, and then I was interested in Black studies, and then but I stayed along the course of neurosurgery because dans nos familles haïtiennes, c'est ingénieur, c'est avocat, c'est docteur, or nurse, So, my father was a radiologist, so I wanted to go into medicine, and then I took a prerequisite humanities course, and then I read Thus Spake Zarathustra by Nietzsche. And Lou, believe it or not, this quote has stuck in my head since I was 18 years old, and I read it in Thus Spake Zarathustra, and Nietzsche opens it up by saying, it was morality that it was morality that protected life against despair and the leap into nothingness among men and classes who were oppressed and violated. For it is the experience of being powerless against man, not nature, that generates the most desperate embitterment against existence. And I read that quote. From that moment on, Lou, I wanted to be a philosopher.
Hold on. Break it down for those of us who speak plain English.
Well, what Nietzsche says is, he began by saying it was morality that protected life against despair and the leap into nothingness. So what he's saying is, it was religion that protected us from killing ourselves. So, because it is the experience of being powerless against man. So what that means is, in our interaction with other people, is when we feel powerless against other people, that is what he says generates the most desperate embitterment against existence. That's what makes us feel despair and nothingness. And religion protects us from that despair and nothingness. And from that moment, I read that quote. And there's another philosopher who cites Nietzsche as his inspiration, and that's Michel Foucault. Foucault loves Nietzsche. But from that moment, I fell in love with Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche would not become my favorite philosopher, even though I agree with many of Nietzsche. In fact, when hopefully we touch this, how Nietzsche inspired me in my using Vodou to understand present day physics and science. But yes, it was Nietzsche that got me into this realm, and I've been in love with philosophy ever since, bro. Philosophy, sociology, and physics, they're my three loves.
Man, Nietzsche is one of the most influential philosophers in modern philosophy.
Yeah, yes,
he has changed not only the way we conceptualize the world and our understanding of morality, because he did try to divorce morality from religion, Christianity.
Yeah, and then he's not even a philosopher; he's a philologist.
Yes, many people don't know that.
Yes,
Nietzsche studied theology.
Yeah, and he est fou.
Yeah, monsieur est fou. Monsieur pensait trop, man.
Yeah. C'est problème ça, me pensait trop. That's why you have to guard. C'est pas que moi men jardin, petit jardin, on est famille c'est paysan so on est moi men petit jardin, but that helps me clear my mind from my food Uncle Nietzsche.
Oh my God, but how did you transition? Well, it's not really a transition. How are you able to establish a relationship between philosophy, science, and religion? In fact, today's topic is Vodou, philosophy, and science, right? How are you able to make, those are three complex disciplines, right? How are you able to establish relationship between those three disciplines?
The thing is, they became three distinctive fields post the Enlightenment period. And the Enlightenment period is the period in which you see the rise, and we call them philosophers, but they're actually scientists. They're building off of the Greek tradition. Remember, the Greek tradition, and my favorite philosopher, by the way, is Bertrand Russell. There's a tie between Bertrand Russell and Albert Camus.
Why I'm not a Christian? Powerful text.
Oh, very powerful, very. But the way he writes it, you would think he's just upset with Christians because they're not living up to the moral creed. Deep down inside, he wants to be a Christian because he sees the value of Christianity, but he sees how others practice Christianity. So that's just the side. I love Bertrand Russell. I think he's the greatest philosopher ever.
He's a giant. He was a
moralist. He's just brilliant. But so during the Enlightenment period, these fields aren't distinct. So Descartes, Rene Descartes, who we in Western philosophy, we date modern Western philosophy with the rise of Rene Descartes. He does not view himself as a philosopher. In his mind, he's doing science. He's trying to put science on a philosophical basis, on an epistemological basis. And they trace that beginning back to the ancient Greeks. And Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, he argues the biggest enemy of philosophy and science was Socrates, because Socrates introduced moralizing into philosophy. Because the early philosophers, they were trying to understand scientifically the world, and they used philosophy and religion. Religion, remember, for these thinkers, is the first form of philosophy. So they view it evolutionarily. So religion is the first form of philosophizing about science. Now, what did religion get wrong? And philosophy corrected what religion got wrong, and we get into the realm of science through this correction. So science became the demystification of religion using philosophy. So philosophy was not a body of ideas. It was an activity. And so that's what Wittgenstein points out. So philosophy became an activity. We use philosophy to demystify what the ancients got wrong and their religiosity, because their religiosity was also a form of science. So we did, and in the Western world, this demystification of religion became the separation between religion and science. So religion became reified as a separate academic discipline and as a separate mode of life, and science became an academic discipline. But in philosophy, they were never separate. It's modern people who've made science, religion, and philosophy three distinct subjects, but they're not.
In fact, this is a good way to transition to the concept of epistemology, right? And your work, right? So epistemology is a branch of philosophy. You wrote an entire book by this title, Haitian Epistemology. Now, first of all, this is what we want you to do for me, okay? I want you to define the concept of Haitian epistemology, and in the same line of thought, how does Vodou metaphysics influence or shape Haitian epistemology?
Okay, bon bye. So let's look at it this way, Luke. Okay, when we study philosophy, all philosophies have basically four components. Every philosophy has a metaphysics, and kisak metaphysics now. Metaphysics, so more that Aristotle came up with, because he wrote a book called On Physics, and the chapter after that was called Metaphysics, Beyond Physics. And what metaphysics is just a description of the physics. So go physics. So every philosophy has a metaphysics which describes kisaki, what is in the world. So is the world material? Is the world, we call it ontology, metaphysics and ontology. So again, metaphysics, again, logic, again, ethics, again, epistemology. So if you want to put it in order, metaphysics comes first, epistemology second, logic, and then you have ethics. Now, when you write a philosophy, because in the Western world, analytical philosophy dominated. By analytical philosophy, we want to say it's what we call a logical, metaphysical, materialist philosophy. So in the Western world, tout bagay is logical and material. So everything is material and it's logical. So lo écrit on philosophy, the metaphysics, the logic, the ethics, and the epistemology is all interconnect. So there must not be any contradiction. The West does not like contradiction.
No,
No. In fact, knowledge in the West progresses by getting rid of contradictions. So pagagin contradiction in Western philosophy. So Konya, so ça veut dire, so therefore in the Western world, materialism is the dominant philosophy. And within this dominant philosophy of materialism, logic is what governs the material world. So tout bagay for you fair logical sense. They have to have logical sense. And the ethics of that material world is an ethic of responsibility. So, excuse me, in the West, everybody is rational and logical, and therefore they are responsible for themselves in other social relationships. That's the ethics that comes out of Western philosophy. Pragmatism comes out of Western philosophy. So, Konya, so therefore, when we study in philosophy, let them study epistemology. Epistemology, what it is the study of how we know what we know. So, ça veut dire, if the West argues that the world is material, how do we know that? That's that's an epistemological question. Comment nous fait connaître que bagay is material? Maybe it's ideal. Bon Dieu created everything, or maybe we're living in a simulation. So to answer those questions, that is the branch of philosophy that answers those questions is epistemology. Now, what we've come to find out is the West always presents itself as though it is modern and it is the creator of rationalism. C'est pas vrai. There's a philosopher, Jacques Derrida. As Jacques Derrida points out, every culture in the world had its own metaphysics, its own logic, its own ethics, and its own what we call axiology, study of value. And all of these cultures presented their position as though it was universal truth. So letting that belong in Afrique, the Africans had their own epistemology, they had their own metaphysics. And they presented their metaphysics just like the West presented their metaphysics as true. So the Africans presented their metaphysics and their ontology and their epistemology as truth as well. So ça veut dire, the problem is, and I mentioned this before, letting that African encountered Western epistemology and Western metaphysics, konya the West parce que they enslaved the African, you the epistemology of the Africans, you say on bagay that is base. That is evil. Everything that came out of Africa was evil. It was dark. It was bad. It was no good. It was primitive. That's the logic to understand everything that we produce. But if you look at it, even what came out of the Western world was primitive as well. Parce que nèg africain yo lè yo wè blanc pour première fois, yo pas connaît pour ça nèg yo mette tout rat ça yo on est en Afrique fait chaud. So nous pas mettre all of the suit of armor that these Europeans, so they view the Europeans as primitive. So I say all of this to say, and when we talk about Haitian epistemology is an African epistemology. Ça veut dire, it is how initially the Africans saw the world. Comment yo comprendre ça yo wè, comment yo, how did they understand comment yo exister among each other? That's how they lived in Africa avant blanc rentrer en Afrique. So when we talk about Haitian epistemology, for me, it's an epistemology that is an authentic African epistemology or African way of knowing, nous te porter nous arriver en Haïti. Now, that's very interesting because there is a debate in Sanuele post-colonial theory. Est-ce que those who were enslaved, those who were subjugated by whites, did they maintain their authentic way of life? Between the Indian, Homi Baba and Gayatri Spivak. Parce que Homi Baba dit oui, you know, the colonized person maintained their authentic existence. Gayatri Spivak dit non. Colonialism, slavery, the subaltern could not speak because he was completely oppressed and exploited. When African and Haiti, they maintain their authentic way of life. In fact, in my book, The Voodoo Ethic and the Spirit of Communism, that's what I argue. There's 3 classes of Haitians. Sometimes we tend to group all the Haitians as one, but that wasn't the case, especially during the Haitian Revolution. Parce que les nègres africains qui parlent de gouvernement en bas nègres affranchis. And then, given that when the revolution begins and ends, presque 70% of nous were directly from Africa, brother.
Yes.
So we maintain an authentic way of life. And the voodoo ethic and the spirit of communism, parce qu'ils sont in Vodou. Jean Casimir, the counterplantation system. It takes Vodou out of its material origin. That's the Vodou. When we started, we were saying Vodou is not a religion in the West. Remember, Christianity didn't start as a religion either. It was a way of life.
Yes.
When they encountered everybody, they interpreted within a Christian lens. And this is where, even though I was trained as a structural Marxist, this is where I differ from Marx, because for me, I take out capitalism comes out of religiosity, the Protestant, this is where I side with paper. But we Vodou par en religion, c'est un mode de vie, a way of life. And then it has its own epistemology. Now, because we experience the same world as whites, as Indians, a lot of the epistemology or the knowledge that will come out of the voodoo is shared by many other religions. Many people don't know this. There is a strong parallel between Vodou and Shintoism. If you understand Japanese Shintoism, Lou, you can't tell if I replace Vodou with Shinto, you wouldn't tell the difference, brother.
Wow.
Spirits don't know where in the West. Your principle, your principle.
Then we're gonna get to that question now.
Yes.
The loi as representative or representation of concept, ideals.
Yes.
But
parce que ça vient arriver. And fait ça parce que I'm gonna always, whenever I teach my students, I always try to use what they understand or what they know to understand what is unfamiliar to them. So, in the West, the demystification, when they were studying the world, they said, trying to establish Western science and Western philosophy on an epistemological basis. Ça il fait, il dit, bon Dieu, mais bon Dieu pas interfere in what goes on in the world, mais bon Dieu allows us to understand the world. In fact, he there's a chapter in the discourse on method in which he argues, is there a religious demon that can trick me into believing what I'm seeing is not real? So, Descartes was a dualist. Ça veut dire, he believed in materialism. There's a real world out there that we can feel, touch, etc. But he was also an idealist. Ça veut dire, mind is superior to the material. And then we have a soul that lives on after death, etc. It's on chrétien,
Yeah, exactly.
So, but when we progress from Descartes to Immanuel Kant, we start to see this ever increasing move away from religion to the point where by the time we get to Immanuel Kant, Kant, number one, is an atheist. He doesn't believe in religion. So by the time we consider Kant, the West does, one of the greatest philosophers.
Malgré ça, monsieur parle de religion.
Oui.
Yeah.
Oui, parce que il parle de religion parce que Descartes begins with religion. So during this period, against six moon that are interaction with one another. Again, Rene Descartes, again Spinoza, again Leibniz, again David Hume, again Berkeley, again Immanuel Kant. In philosophy, we call them the rationalists versus the empiricists. Ça veut dire, yo dit comme ça, beginning with Descartes said, so best when people comprendre knowledge or understand how the world is a mind. Reason will help you. You don't have to do any. He doesn't completely get away from empiricism, but he said you need a mind. And then the empiricists do know everything we know comes from experience, right? Immanuel Kant vient mettre on some to the point where Immanuel Kant, we can never be sure what we see and what we know is real, because he says that how we know the world comes from what he calls the form of the understanding. I mean, man sees the world differently from a dog, from a cat, etc. But how we see the world as the human being, does that make it more superior or better, or the nature of reality as such versus a dog? C'est ça il dit. Parce que he says there's only two ways we can know: empiricism or rationalism.
Pendant dit ça, hold on. Pendant on parle de Kant là, bon moi interrupt you for a minute, okay? Parce que dans livre ça, vous parlez de what you call Kantian transcendental idealism.
Oh, I'm getting there, brother.
Yeah, quand vous comparez lui avec Vilokan, right? Vilokan Vodou idealism. Quelle relation il y a entre
c'est ça, ma boy. You cut me off, but c'est ça, ma boy. So ça Kant dit, we can never know the nature of reality for real, because there's certain things we can't see because our sights are programmed a certain way. So there's certain things we can't see. There's certain sounds we cannot hear as human beings. But because we cannot hear them or we cannot see them, does that mean they don't exist? Of course not. They do. Dogs can hear at a higher pitch than human beings can. But does that mean those sounds doesn't exist? No, they don't exist to us, etc. Man, now this is the relationship. Remember, all human beings experience the same earth. So, non Vodou dit même pas là, mais Vodou pas dit, unlike Kant dit we can never know the nature of reality as such. Vodou pas dit ça. Because what Kant eliminates out of epistemology, remember, epistemology is how do we know, what we see, etc. Sa Western philosophy, and this begins with Kant, sa yung tiré dans epistemology c'est dream. Remember, m'akone ou Haitien frère, gen de lo timoun, maman toujours dit, oh, pas sorti nom de faire un rêve pour.
Exactement.
Sorti, on m'a l'air.
Yes.
Western philosophy retire ça out of epistemology. Ne Vodou pas retirer ça out of epistemology. Parce que non Vodou, it's not on, remember, Kant's philosophy is called transcendental idealism, but parce que il dit comme ça, the mind Vodou impose on the world what we see. So what we see is subjective idealism. But because we share the same mind, we can deduce an objectivity out of that subjective idealism that the mind emplaces. Vodou pas dit ça. Vodou dit comme ça. There is a real world out there that we can know. And how do we know this world? We can know it through dreams. We can know it through revelations, psychic revelation. In science, we call that postmaterialism. Because in contemporary science, there is a distinction that is made between materialism and postmaterialism. Postmaterialism against Kantian, because Western philosophy will build on a materialism. What postmaterialism is trying to do is reintroduce the concept of epistemology that we find in Vodou and the Eastern tradition. C'est pas seul Vodou qui dit we can know the truth through telepathy, through dreams, through divine revelation. No, Shintoism dit même bagaille là. Esprit ancêtres yo ka vinn parler avec nous qui dit there is an afterlife. Immanuel Kant in the Western tradition dit no, this cannot be a part of epistemology. No, parce que we cannot verify it. Il y a un concept in Western philosophy qui est the verification principle. What we know or how we justify what we know is based on the proof that we have for its justification. So Ned Blanc vient retirer rêve esprit qu'a vinn parler and we all know her, we love her, she's part of our Haitian culture. Gen pile moun qui pa kwe nan sa Baïne Bello écrit parce que Baïne Bello toujours dit c'est ça li qui vinn parler avec nan. But that's a part of the Haitian epistemology. We believe we can get revelation from the ancestors, from dreams, from so this constitutes epistemology. Western epistemology retire tout ça out of epistemology. So epistemology in the West is boiled down between a synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. Ça veut dire what we know is based on what we see in our logical explanation of what we see. So this is what constitutes science in the West: a synthesis of materialism, empiricism, and rationalism. Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism is what gives rise to Western science that we study in the academy. In Eastern tradition and in the Haitian tradition, and I include Haitian epistemology in the Eastern tradition because for me, say Afriki Banu all knowledge. Vodou is the oldest quote unquote way of life. Il dépasse Hinduism, il dépasse Buddhism. Mais nous pas négative credit because of slavery and racial ideology that have oppressed us. So that's why we have to juxtapose Haitian epistemology with Western epistemology. Parce que mon interview Max Beauvoir, the late Max Beauvoir, son vaudouisme, he was the IT of Vodou prior to his death. Il dit avant Haïtien prend plante pour faire médecine avec. Faut prier, faut dire plante là parce que toute plante a esprit. Tout bagaille in Vodou a esprit. Now here's the interesting thing. In physics, there is a return to this concept of animism. In Western in the Western tradition, we call it panpsychism. That's the big thing in physics. And this is why Vodou is so important, Lou. Since slavery, Neg Noir, we've been chasing white people and as though white people possess all knowledge. C'est pas vrai. Because now, even the first philosopher, and he's one of the great, Arthur Schopenhauer, to get from Western philosopher to Nietzsche, had to go to Hinduism to get this notion of the will. In contemporary physics, Einstein gets to the theory of relativity, he had to go to Hinduism, monoism, all of that. Through the next style, contemporary physics in the Western tradition, it was at a standstill with Newtonian physics. So they can progress, they had to go back to Hinduism and the ancients. So don't feel like in Vodou that can explain contemporary physics and contemporary philosophy. And this is where my work comes in because I'm using Vodou to understand the origins and nature of consciousness contemporarily, which I argue is
in fact, that's my next question. Parce que you use the term Haitian science, right? You use the term Haitian science, you present Vodou as science.
Yes.
So in fact, Check this out. This is the work. This is the text right here. So my question is this. So if, in what ways, right? I'm saying that not pluriel, different ways, right? Vodou is considered like science or a form of science. In other words, how does the Vodou tradition help us to understand modern science? For example, you mentioned the notion of consciousness, quantum physics, right? Yeah, give us some lumière.
Well, we'll start with simply first. Remember, Vodou is a way of life. So Vodou was used to, Vodou has its own metaphysics to explain, and by way of life, we said it's a science that explains the origins of the world and the origins of humanity and how we ought to live in the world. So all, and that's the metaphysical basis. All religions, even in the West, has the same thing. Metaphysics, God created, the Christians say God created the world in 7 days, whatever. It has a logic, it has a metaphysics. Same thing with Vodou. Vodou has a metaphysics that says, one bon Dieu who created the world, mais puissamment tellement gros that he gives us concept by which we ought to live, and principles and concepts by which we ought to live, and how we ought to interact with nature. So therefore, Vaudouism have an intimate relationship between nature, because bon Dieu is the world is created out of bon Dieu. So you have to respect the world that you live in, because it's God. It's a sort of Spinozian pantheism. Spinoza developed pantheism that the world and God are one. So we have to respect the world. So everything we need to survive comes from the environment. If we are sick, then herbal medicine is plays a very important role in the Haitian culture and the Haitian tradition. The other day, my country, I have weeds growing up in my backyard. She said, "Oh no, I thought they were weeds." You know what I'm saying? But it's that intimate relationship that says everything we need is provided by Bon Dieu, which is the God, which is the universe. So not only does it tell us how to interact, but it also tells us what happens to us when we. Max Beauvoir, when I was writing the book, The Voodoo Spirit of Communism, Max Beauvoir, in Vodou, we have reincarnation. Vodou dit comme ça, we come back, we're reborn 16 times, 8 times as a man, 8 times as a woman. And the point of that rebirth is to find perfection. So Vodou get tout ça liji. Now, for me, this is where part of my Western training comes in. Because now, does that mean everything in Vodou is correct? No, just like everything in the Western tradition is not completely accurate. Because for me, as a trained philosopher and scientist, I do believe in the universal truth. I believe there is one truth that we all must attempt to ascertain and live by. So, then aspect de Vodou, which is inaccurate, you know. So I use Vodou. I don't begin when I philosophize and when I write. And by writing, I mean when I try to understand the nature of the world. I don't begin with the Western tradition, because the Western tradition has corrupted a lot of what we know, and because of its religiosity, because of its racism, because of its pathologization of the Eastern tradition, it has pathologized a lot of our knowledge, and with this ideology. So I always begin any concept that I'm trying to understand. I always begin with the Vodou tradition in order to get at the Western understanding, in order to reconcile it, to come up as close as possible to a universal truth. So in my use of Vodou to understand consciousness, what I do is I begin with, what does Vodou say about consciousness? Vodou said our consciousness constitutes part of God's consciousness, and after our 16 rebirths, we reunite with Bon Dieu. I begin with that concept, and then I understand the Western tradition. The Western tradition says consciousness, this is the material aspect, consciousness is a product of what they call the neural correlates of consciousness, or the neural correlates of the brain. So the brain produces consciousness. Once you die, there's no more consciousness. So you're gone forever. That's it. There is a post-materialism that has emerged within the last 20 years that begins with the voodoo tradition that says, no, there is consciousness beyond life. And many of the evidence for that are the same that are utilized in Vodou. Nan Vodou, yo di zanset yo ka vin pala avon nan gwen. Well, in the Western tradition, we have what's called consciousness beyond life, or near-death experiences. There are people who have had heart attacks, who in that process of, during their heart attacks, they've seen a light, they've seen their dying their family members who have passed. And when they've been resuscitated, they've actually articulated these experiences. And now these experiences constitute a body of work in psychology as well as in physics to justify the notion that consciousness exists after life. So what I do is, many of these concepts in the post-materialist approach, they use quantum physics to understand what happens to us when we die. For example, there's this law, and I don't want to confuse your audience because it could get very technical. There's something called quantum entanglement, superposition, multiverse. Now, Vodou, they say there's two worlds. There's this world that we experience, and then there's an opposite world that reflects our alter ego. No, we call that the multiverse. No, and quantum
and physics.
And mathematically, we can justify this notion of multiverse. So the MIMSA, I use these concepts and I see their parallel in Vodou to try to get at the nature and origins of consciousness. And in I call my theory consciousness field theory, and I'm the first to argue that there's a fifth force of nature. Consciousness is a fifth force of nature. And c'est dans Vodou prend ça. Parce que Vodou dit, the first force was God's consciousness. So if God's consciousness was the first force and we're an embodiment of God, that means consciousness is itself a fifth force of nature. So I don't know if your audience know, but the West have known four forces of nature: gravity, electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear force.
Well, so that's your contribution, right?
Yes, that's my contribution. Yes.
Okay.
But
let me ask you a question, Dr. Mocombe. Est-ce que, for example, people who are Vodouists, those who are possessed par loyo, they also embody the Loa's consciousness. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yes. Yes, and this is why, and oh God, that's such a brilliant question, Dr. This is why my contribution is so important, because remember, in the Western tradition, the brain creates consciousness. Because when your brain dies, that's the end of your Dr. Lou no longer exists, and we will never know Dr. Lou. Mais dans Vodou, c'est pas ça. Parce que dans Vodou, when someone is possessed, c'est shualam. The body is used for another consciousness. It could be the consciousness of an ancestor. It could be the consciousness of a long dead spirit. The consciousness replaces the original consciousness. So therefore, the brain is a receiver and facilitator of consciousness. That's a very important concept. So if the brain doesn't create consciousness, but it facilitates consciousness, remember, there's a principle in philosophy called the verification principle. How can we verify what's going on? And this is how I got into Vodou truly, because if l'air en choix is possessed. That's another consciousness that's using the brain of the person that is possessed to speak for itself. And how do we know what that a true loi? Then if why they're prognosticators, they tell you things that has happened to you in the past. They tell you things that will happen to you in the future. For example, Gede no Vodou. Gede is a prognosticator. Gede can tell you your future. Gede ka fon pil bagay na let nous celebrate loi Gede. And this is I'm not a spiritual person, but this is where I got into Vodou. And you know, when I got, go ahead, brother.
Hold on to that thought. Parce qu'on commençait à expliquer, par exemple, Gede, qui ça le représentait, conceptually,
yes,
ideally, right?
Yes.
Parce que me songeais dans le livre ça, right? Now, this is my, Paul, I have to admit, this is one of my favorite books of yours. Vous connaissez qu'on parle de Vodou and things. This is great, but I love this book. But, we voulons nous faire une petite transition tout petit. Parce que, on parle de nous menons world of Vodou, right? Et puis que, you take the Kantian concept, transcendental idealism, right? Ou appliquer l'histoire les transcendental ideals of law, right?
Yes.
So, in other words, what do those laws, Vodou law, represent conceptually, and ideally in the physical world first, and in the metaphysical realm? What, of course, the world of Vilokan.
Yes. So we got to tie all this together. So Kant makes the distinction between the phenomenal world. Remember, I told you that Kant takes dreams, he takes telepathy, he takes all of that out of epistemology. And then what we're left with in the Western tradition is rationalism and empiricism, and Kant synthesizes the two. And so what he argues is, all we can know is phenomenon. And now what is phenomenon? Phenomenon is what we experience in the material world. And Kant argues all we can know is what we experience in the material world. And he makes that distinction between phenomena and what he calls noumena. Noumena is how the world is in and of itself without human experience or any other experience. And he says we can never know that world because we are pre-programmed to experience the phenomenal world. Vodou ba di sa. Vodou di, not only can we know phenomenon because we experience it, but we can also know noumena because out of noumena we get phenomena. From experience, when an ancestor exists, Zanset sa mouri, he goes to the noumenal world. And when he comes to speak to us in dreams, during possessions, what they're bringing with them is not only knowledge of their experiences of the phenomenal world, but they're also bringing knowledge of the noumenal world. And so this is a very important concept because it is dream possession, it is possession, it is revelations through dreams. C'est comme ça the leaders in Vodou know about the noumenal world. For example, so Max Beauvoir dit, we are reincarnated 16 times, 8 times as a man, 8 times as a woman. Well, the question I asked, the epistemological question I have for you and Max, Dr. Lewis, how do you know that? And Max Beauvoir's verification for that is, Zanset, you'll reveal that to us in dreams. Voodoo, we maintain epistemologically that knowledge can come from the noumenal world, from those who have gone before us, the ancestors.
So that's special revelation.
Yes,
this is what Christian theologians call special revelation.
Yes. Okay. And remember, In the Western scientific tradition, can you and I present that as knowledge at a conference? Of course not.
Y'all mettez nous dehors.
But no more New York G. No.
Yeah.
And what's happening now in contemporary Western science is post-materialism is starting to bring down Charles Schwartz and many of these other scholars, the previous Nobel Prize winner in physics, Roger Penrose. They're starting to bring those concepts back into the Western tradition. And this is important. So, no Vodou, we take this Kantian distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, but whereas Kant says we can't know anything about the noumenal world, all we can know is about phenomena. Vodou dit, in the Haitian tradition, dit no. Bon, même de toujours vin dit, bons ancêtres qui disent pour pas sortir, pour pas aider, parce qu'on va être mal élevé. That comes from the noumenal world. That's the world as it is in itself. In my writing, what I've done is I've maintained that noumenal world that comes from Vodou, but I call it the absolute vacuum. It's also called the absolute vacuum in physics too, believe it or not. But and the absolute vacuum is where all the elementary particles are one. This is what would give rise to what we call quantum tunneling and the Big Bang. And then, so everything from that absolute vacuum becomes the phenomenal world that we experience. So that's, in my work, that's the connection between Vodou, my physics, and hopefully I win a Nobel Prize for it once they connect, this fifth force of nature to consciousness. But that's the connection between, it's just I don't believe, there's this, in notre tradition, we have the Negritude movement coming out of the French Antilles, and then we have the Afrocentric tradition. Laodi, you have to throw everything out with the baby with the bathwater. That's absurd. You know what I'm saying? Même si Nexayo était raciste, Kant was a racist. All of them were racist. Everything we know in Western science came from racist people. You know what I'm saying?
Of course.
They were racist. That's only one element of their existence. Because many of what comes out of our tradition, these people really don't understand. That's why Einstein returned to the Eastern and African tradition to understand contemporary physics. Because you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Wow. I'm going to go back, Gary. Now, let me ask you a question here. So I want, in this book, Theory of Phenomenological Structuralism, I'm on page 41. Côté que ou point 14 major law dans Vodou, ou ba yo chaque symboliser your concept, right? Par exemple, que tant ou gen leg ba,
yes,
would be the key to the spiritual world, communication. So that's the law of hermeneutics.
Yes.
What we call hermeneutics in philosophy.
Yes.
Yes, no loi sa yo nous capable the scientist law. Not from the Western, not from the African world now. From the Western idea of science.
No, Ugadi Legba was the law of wisdom. So law of wisdom, c'est lui même qui bon, c'est important parce que bon même c'est valorisant, loi c'est Legba ou bon and so we can, in the Western tradition, we can say this isn't far. We don't even have to make a distinction between Western and Eastern tradition, because if you read Plato, Plato has the same concept. He just calls it theory of forms. He get concept of beauty.
Yes.
Look at Esli Fred said represent love and beauty. Esli Dantar, motherhood, leg by wisdom. C'est concept. So we can say we leg by in the Western tradition is the concept of wisdom, because he has practical knowledge. And that's what science is, practical wisdom and practical knowledge, and how we experience the nature of reality as it's presented to us. So Nuka Legba is that not only does he represent hermeneutics, but he also represents wisdom. That's what scientists are. Scientists are just philosophers.
Et puis, ou dit Ogu Badagris, that's the scholar law.
Yes. Oui.
Monsieur prophesy.
Yes. Which is different because remember, in the Western tradition, by prophecy.
No, Bagesa.
So that's where the African tradition, you'll maintain that. But they're going to dire comme ça, Desaline, who is Ogu Feyen Vodou, because he became an ancestor. They honored him that way by making him a live Vodou. He represents political. He was a political warrior.
Yeah, Ogu Ferai. Yes.
Oui, exactement. So, ça c'est tout doit représenter un concept au mode de vie that we constitute our lives around. C'est ça. Mais ça fait demystify Voodoo, même Jean Descartes, tout next side, they demystify Christianity. Remember, Descartes commenced by throwing everything he knows out the window, the Bible, and he bases his epistemology on God. When demystify Voodoo, because okay, this is the language they use to understand the world. Now let's demystify that language. Let's demythologize that language. Parce que l'on parle avec Vaudouisant en Haïti, tant que Max Beauvoir, yo pas ouais Vaudou comme une religion. In fact, Max Beauvoir is a brilliant scholar. When you read his work,
a chemist, right? A chemist by training,
he was
right?
A chemist. And what he did was he demystified everything around herbal medicine in Vodou. And he there's a chapter in one of these books in which he outlines practically every herbal medicine in Vodou and explain from what we would call a Western tradition why it works the way it works in our system. It's just brilliant, and I think he doesn't get enough credit for what he's done. And that's another thing we need to start to do. We need to start to demystify and reconceptualize our way of life, so that we can get Haiti out of the quagmire that's its in. Because if we just rely on the Western tradition, brother, we just gonna be stuck where we are right now. You know.
So now, we've been talking about the relationship or the interplays between Voodoo, science, physics, quantum physics, consciousness, idealism, transcendentalism. Mais what is Voodoo? Tout le monde veut entendre ça. Now let's break it down. Qu'est-ce que Voodoo est?
Voodoo at the end is the African science. It represents his way of life, how he experiences the world that he's encountered, just like Christianity did the same thing for the Western tradition. Voodoo fait même bagay la. Problem nous vinn genyen is when we take Voodoo and we try to place it on the level of the 5 religions. So you have Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. We want, just like Buddha did not intend for his philosophy to be turned into religion, for them to deify, apotheosize Buddha. It is important. When we come in the West, because of racial ideology and racial prejudice and stereotype, they've come to turn Voodoo into black magic, Voodoo Dolls. Where I remember when I was growing up in 1984, they came out with a movie called The Serpent in the Rainbow.
Yes.
The anthropologist who went to study in
Haiti.
Wade,
the guy from Harvard,
Wade
right?
David. Yeah.
Yep.
So Voodoo became, everybody who saw that movie, they looked at Haitian. And so what we have to come to realize that it is a way of life, just like all other ways of life. And there are different interpretation and way of life in Vodou, just like we find in Shintoism and Hinduism, etc. Vodouism, they don't practice the same way. You know what I'm saying? Some they worship their spiritual ancestors. There are some who they worship, par exemple, c'est Azili. So il fait cérémonie Azili, whatever, you get peristilio, whatever. Man, it is a way of life. So Lord Vodou, we have to get the image, the racial stereotypes and images that the West have implanted in our minds, that it represents black magic. It is the primitive way of. Because remember, the Western tradition has always placed knowledge on an evolutionary scale. So Vodou represents the most primitive form of religiosity, and we, because we are socialized in the same environment, we start to think the same way as these Western scholars. So we've taken Vodou and we've reified it as the religion. We turned them into deities, just like you find saints in the Catholic. Man, that's not the concept. With the introduction of Protestantism in Haiti, they've demonized Vodou. The very tradition that we celebrate to help us gain our independence, we've demonized it, just like in the Western tradition. Man, again, ça va dire Lou, pas gen moun qui utilise concept dans Vodou pour attaquer l'autre monde. There's good and bad people in every worldview.
Ça existe dans toute religion.
Not tout bagaille.
Yeah.
If you want to meet a bad person, there's two places.
Yeah. Utilise religion.
My grandfather said, if you want to meet an evil person, there's two places you go. The Protestant church and jail.
No, c'est vrai. Dr. Mocombe, attendez. Michel, we can talk 4 hours here. But, me pose une question. What would you say is the most influential text on the Vodou tradition in the past, let's say 40 to 50 years?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Let me see. The work you and your co-author have begun to do, I think that those are tremendous. Don't get me wrong. See, the problem that's happened in the Haitian tradition is there's 3 types of scholars that has dominated Haiti's intellectual tradition. You have the lawyer turned academic who they study law, and then all of a sudden they want to write on stuff they have no concepts about, and they think they know everything because they study law. Then you have the journalist turned intellectual. Because they've traveled, they've reported on, they think they can write on every concept, blah, blah, blah. And the most dominating intellectual in the Haitian tradition has been anthropologists, unfortunately.
Yes.
Haiti's anthropologists dominate the Haitian intellectual tradition. So it's rare that you find philosophers and sociologists who approach the subject matter from an alternative. Remember, anthropology comes out of the racist tradition. So, some of those concepts have influenced how Haitian anthropologists write about Vodou. Many of their writings tend to be descriptive. It's not explanatory. And I think the work you and many of your colleagues have begun to do from a understanding Vodou from a philosophical, theological, a hermeneutical perspective, I think those are very important. I don't discount what the anthropologists, I take them with a grain of salt, brother, to be honest with you.
So dis ça. En pile nèg pas le fâché avant parce que
Yo men fâché.
Ça fait avec ainsi par la langue.
Jean-Price Mars, he gets a lot of it wrong. Remember, his writing is reactionary. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
These guys are coming from a time where the negritude movement is, and the most important, I love this brother here. Frantz Fanon is the most, people don't give Fanon enough credit because Fanon has a critique of negritude, I think, that has devastated a lot of the scholarship that comes out of that period. Jean-Price Mars, Exile, their writing is reactionary. They're writing in reaction to the American occupation of Haiti. So therefore, they want to identify a distinctive explanation for the Haitian condition, the Haitian tradition, and they turn to the peasant class. You see what I'm saying?
Yes,
so when you buy a paysan, your valet, because the West devalued. So many of their work is reactionary. You know what I'm saying? It's not philosophical. It's not sociological. They're praising something that they really don't fully grasp. You see what I'm saying? And this is where your work and Patrick Balaguer and many of the scholars in the Haitian and HSA, their work, and even then, remember that's still dominated by anthropologists now, brother. You know what I'm saying?
No, I mean, that fact, I tell you what, man. To that fact, what you are offering or what you have offered to Haitian studies, young Haitian scholars, a philosophical understanding of Voodoo, and really, I mean, I've changé finance. Ça fait que travail ou fait yo doit traduire en créole en français.
Oh, absolutely, brother, absolutely. C'est ça parce que
no one else has done this before.
Yeah.
This people will say, well, Dr. Lou, well, Dr. Mocombe is your friend. No, you just have to read the guy's work. Read his writing. You see what I'm saying? The brilliance, right? The brilliance embedded in every single page.
Yeah.
But okay. I'm gonna shift to Haitian studies. What is the most important, the most influential work in Haitian studies in the past 40 to 50 years? Même temps.
Let me see. In Haitian studies, believe it or not, there's two works that I think are very influential on that will direct the course of Haitian studies. And I want to say it begins with Jean Casimir.
Yeah. You mean his new book, The Haitians?
Yes. Not, well, his new book is just a collection of his previous work.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I think very important because he and I build my work off of his. But we also have to give credit to people like Laurent Dubois, who they've taken. Remember, many of the European scholars who are writing on Haitian studies, many of them, you know what I'm saying? They've never been to Haiti.
Never.
So you have emerging young white scholars who are traveling to Haiti, who are going in the voodoo sector. The voodoo sector has maintained a lot of our history. Remember, in Haitian studies, the Haitian historiography is very polemical and very ideological. We have to demystify that. Let's be honest here, brother.
Yes, sir.
You know, we've had a mulatto tradition, we've had a black bourgeois tradition, and when you read them, you're reading two different histories, brother. So many of the Western scholars who are beginning to write on Haitians, they're going to Haiti, they're going into Laurent Dubois' work, The Avengers of the New World, I think was a very powerful text when it came out. And he builds off Jean Casimir's work. Prior to that, many traditions, remember, whenever you introduce Haitian studies to anybody, the first book they mentioned to you said Black Jacobins.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the worst mistake because that book is so ideological, Lou. It is ridiculous. It is written by a Marxist who is trying to fit Haiti into a model that he had. It's just ridiculous, brother. So I think it's a mistake. Everybody always points to Black Jacobins. No. Whenever anybody asks me to read anything on here, I say begin with Avengers of the New World, and then Haiti, the making of the history, and there's Julia Gaffield is coming out with some work. Look what the field of Haitian studies has done to Jean-Jacques Dessalines, brother. This was a brilliant brother. You know what I'm saying? Man, growing up, Dessalines, they sought Lou, and it is these young, vibrant scholars who are coming out. And unfortunately, yo ba semble moi avoir ou kompon sa on ban from blanche la écrit and it's sad, but the problem is, and this is why your work is so important, because you're showing young Haitians that nous pas besoin musiciens, nous pas besoin artistes, blah blah blah. This is a field that needs exploring. Haitian history is rich, brother, and the sad thing is there's not enough of us doing read the research, and there are young people who are hungry for the knowledge, Lou. Yes. And I think what you're doing with your highlighting Haitian scholars and the work you're doing with these videos, I think that's gonna open up the field even more.
Thank you.
We have to get out of anthropology. We have to get the lawyers out of Haitian historiography. And then the other, I forgot the fourth one, the biggest one of all, negligiati. I know you're a poet, brother, but Haiti says poésien qui écrit sur Haitian history, like they
no. Mais réalité, avant que nous allions, c'est que, vous connaissez, majorité histoire haïtienne, par exemple, majorité haïtienne qui écrit histoire d'Haïti, pas gen yon nan yo qui professional historien, non?
No, at all.
Ou capable compter avec douet, oui, ça c'est yon. Jodi, c'est avocat, c'est médecin, tout nek sa yo deveni. Alors, m'pa di ça pour m'capable, nous pas di ça pour nous undermine their work.
No.
In fact, those guys have made tremendous contributions.
Yes, absolutely.
Même j'ai tout dans Vodou.
Yes.
Un peu de monde qui écrit sur Vodou. Un peu de monde ça a pas get training in religious studies.
No.
You know what I'm saying? Ou bien theology.
Yes.
Mais you fait un pile contribution.
Yes.
So I hope people you understand that. We're not trying to undermine people's scholarship or but we're not.
Training is important, brother.
Very important.
It's very important.
Very important.
Very important because you know the sad thing is when Western science critique these scholarship, they critique them on technical grounds. That's why they don't make them available in their classes, because they feel they're not technically sound. The writing is poor, etc., etc. And you know how the Western tradition marginalized work. So, c'est ça. And many of these scholars, you'll probably publier in peer-reviewed journals. You'll find that. So therefore, their scholarship is devalued. And to be fair to the Western tradition, I do hold technicality and publication. I think those are very valuable. That's what gives the work prominence. You see what I'm saying? So fortunately, I hope, we can continue this, what you're doing, even what Pascal is doing. I know Pascal can be a little polemical, but he's bringing.
But we need people like Pascal.
Yes, we do definitely, brother, because he's bringing the scholars to, even though he'll get into debates with you, he's bringing it to the forefront, and I think we need to do more of that. And then we have to see. Remember, and I know Haitians don't like to hear that. For a long time, the historiography, all writings on Haiti were dominated by the mulatto class of our country, and they bastardized many of the writings. You see what I'm saying? And that's an element we don't like to talk about out loud. Even when you go to HSA, brother, it's still dominated by them. You know what I'm saying? So, but I know you, J.G., you all are starting to go. Since I come by, HSA.
No besoin HS.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna start to go to more conferences. Definitely, brother.
Pascal.
Yes,
other brilliant Haitian scholars.
Yes.
I tell you what, people. Go ahead.
No, parce que Lou, you'll be surprised. You know, during I know this is May is Haitian Heritage Month. You'll be surprised how the thirst for knowledge, and many, they don't have the knowledge of the history of the country, the rich history. Brother, it is, our history is rich, and our children, even our parents, they don't know many of the history, and it's sad. We need to do more things like this, and I wish you complete success, brother. I really do.
Man, before we go, again, this is Dr. Paul Mocombe. This is Faith, Reason, and Dialogue with me, Dr. Lou. But before we go, okay, Dr. Mocombe, on about 2 minutes, parce qu'on ne parle en pile même Javel. Mais dernière question que j'ai pour vous, c'est pour capable. M'ta dit moun yo, nan ki façon que Voodoo as a system, right? Has impacted, influenced Haitian identity. M'ba 2 minutes pour répondre question ça.
Oh, that's hard to answer in 2 minutes, but I'm going to try. Well, for nous comprendre, after the revolution, remember, we stated during this our whole discourse, 70% of the population was directly from Africa when the revolution commences and ends. So the struggle over control over Haiti is between 3 groups, technically. Again, the emerging Black bourgeois class in Haiti, the mulatto elites, un group des Africains who want to reproduce their way of life on the island.
So,
oui,
pendant ça là, bon monter mon livre là quand on discutait by ça.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lou.
Identity and Ideology and Haiti, the Children of Sans Souci, Dessalines, Toussaint, and Pétion. There we go. All right, keep going.
So les yo assassiné Dessalines, majorité nan Africain yo, ça nous vient les nègandé yo. They went to the mountains and in the provinces where they established a way of life, which I call the voodoo ethic and the spirit of communism, which Jean Casimir calls the counter plantation system. So next time you système agriculture, tout bagay, religion, yo, médecine, yo, all of it came out of Voodoo and the practice of Voodoo. Même lugar où concept, tout le monde connaît ça, lugar où y a concept ça, yo. Those were social institutions that were.
So you're talking about secret societies in
yes,
Voodoo.
yes. They were secret societies in Voodoo that were put in place to protect the communities in the mountains. So you have to look at for point concept. Bizango, they're the police force of Voodoo. Soon, if you're practicing prostitution, Bizango, and they protected the society. So over time, these formulated institutions in the provinces, in the mountains, that when you get this de-agriculturalization of Haiti, many of paysans, they descended into the cities, and you put their concepts into the cities. So we can get lugar, we can get but that comes out of Voodoo and how they institutionalized their societies in the mountains and in the provinces. So even tout haïtien gen on fait, souvent on fait mal, on fait pour lui. All of that comes from the peasant class. And this is important. And I'm going to end with this, because in the Western tradition, there's been this struggle over because of the constitution of capitalism and how capitalism has socialized everything, the world completely, who will liberate the masses from capitalism? In the Western tradition, the onus fell on the working class, what Marx called the proletariat. And they were the urban working class, and they were supposed to be at the vanguard of the revolution. Mais ça, France Fanon and many Haitians, and this is where Jean Price Moss and people like ça with me, they gave that onus to the peasant class. Because the peasant class, especially in Haiti, because they were not part of they maintain a tradition that could stand against the capitalist tradition. And Frantz Fanon would build on that. And that's why I think many people need to read more of Fanon, especially the Wretched of the Earth, on how the peasant class, and c'est même bagay Jean Price Master dit, c'est paysan yo. If we want to change Haiti, we have to look to the peasant class. C'est ça. Because they were outside of the exploitation of capitalism, the oppressive nature of capitalism, and they represented, although this is idealizing them to some extent, a way of life that many Haitians want to run to today. Parce que depuis on parle avant Haïtien, oh, tu payes une douce, mais le mais la caille, ou tu t'as bien bonne, c'est bien rester avec, blah, blah, blah. They romanticize that peasant class, and we have to be aware of that too. Now, don't get me wrong.
Non, ça c'est important.
Malveillant.
Oui.
so we have to look to that tradition and how it constituted our identity and gave us the strength to fight against slavery and capitalist exploitation, and take the best part of that to reconstitute Haiti. See nobody fast out, brother. I have no hope. I see no hope, man. I really don't, brother.
So you still see the future of Haiti?
Yes, absolutely.
Does it lie in the culture of Haitian peasants?
Oui, absolutely. That communal culture.
That communal, okay.
You know, my parents still keep that tradition. Yes, absolutely. So I still hold on to that Fanonian tradition that the peasantry offers us a mode of life, which, you know, as I said before, Casimir calls the counter-plantation system. I call it the voodoo ethic and the spirit of communism. It was a communal way of life. So,
but you know, Dr. Mocombe, I'm afraid that it's like the world is moving every day, moving progressively or aggressively toward capitalism, right?
Oh, yes.
What we, you know, what you call the Voodoo ethic, right? Communism, right? The sense of, you know, communal living.
Yes, the mind, no sociology, we call that the mind shaft. You know what I'm saying? So, I'm giving, but don't worry, Lou. And you know, even in the Bible, it says, eventually nature is going to fight back, because capitalism operates on the logic that there is an unlimited possibility for growth and economic gain. But we live in a finite resource world. So eventually, you can't grow anymore. In fact, climate change is forcing us to change, but man, human being is becoming recalcitrant. We refuse to change our way of life. The world cannot sustain this any longer. We're exploiting the environment. Just think about it this way. At the turn of the 20th century, we had 20% fresh water. At the beginning of the 21st century, Lou, we have less than 1% fresh water available for usage. We have polluted the environment, global warming. In 50 years, if we're alive, brother, we're threatening nuclear war over capitalist resources. Eventually, it's either we change towards that communal way of life that comes out of Voodoo. I say myself, Voodoo, this way of life. You find it in Shintoism. You find it in Buddhism.
Presque tout indigenous culture.
Yeah, and even Christianity.
Ça que vient avec Christianity, c'est mon blanc au gâte Christianity.
Yeah, exactly.
Because primitive Christianity is very communal.
Very communal, very communal. Well, like they say, Jesus was a socialist.
Yeah, he was, man. He was. Man, Dr. Paul Mocombe, nous parlons presque pour une heure et demie là,
Yo, brother, you want it. If you want some, Pascal, if you want some, you know.
But I'll tell you what, you have to come back for part 2. Parce que m'ta aimé que nous parler de Voodoo nature environment.
Oh, definitely. That's
parce
key.
que c'est un topic que nous pas parler de lui, mais ça important surtout, you know, Haiti is going through environmental crisis, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So for example, what does the Voodoo religion can teach us about environment?
C'est secteur Vodou qui a protégé l'environnement Haïti.
Mais c'est ça fait que nous voulons pour finir.
C'est ça fait que nous voulons finir. Absolutely, brother.
Yeah. Part 2, c'est ça que nous pourrons parler. Again, people, this is Dr. Paul Mocombe, our distinguished guest, philosopher, social scientist, and of course, this is Dr. Lou, your host, Faith, Reason, and Dialogue. Mes amis, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks from now. Dr. Paul, peace out.
Peace out, brother. Thank you.
Sir. All right. Take care.